Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to Lifespan Growth and Development. I'm Professor Kyle Edens. I teach here at Richland College. And we're going to talk about, let me open this up from current slide. There we go. Okay, and so what we're going to talk about in this class is we're going to talk about human growth and development from conception to death. Now, both of those definitive parameters are a little obscure in modern society, but that's how we're going to talk about it. And we also want to make sure that we're not just talking about human growth and development, but we may also talk about the growth and development of various animal species if it elucidates more and provides us with more background information about lifespan, growth, and development as it relates to the human condition. But going back to from conception to death, well, one of the things we want to keep in mind is that preconception, there's a lot that can go on with gametes, which gametes are sperm and egg, and there's a lot that can go on within those gametes that can influence the future development of the organism. And then there are some at the end of life that are trying to do things like cryogenically freeze bodies, and maybe one day there might be an opportunity to reanimate that body. Of course, this is nothing that we can do now, but they are suspending the animation of people to see if maybe one day that can happen. And then also we have different types of death. There's brain death. There are many different forms of death. And in some cases, through modern medicine, we've been able to bring some people back from those vegetative states. So it's a little blurred on both ends of the spectrum, but that's what we're talking about, conception to death. All right, we're going to define psychology as the scientific study of behavior and underlying mental processes. The underlying mental processes are cognition and emotion, or what we're going to talk about as affect. Now, we talk about those as underlying mental processes because the only thing we can really see and observe is behavior. So we've got to keep that in mind. We can only see and observe and document behavior. Even with the best of instruments, we're just observing the behavior of neurons and neuronal firings, or we're looking at hormone concentrations in maybe the blood or some other biological fluid or waste potentially. And so with that information, though, we can infer the mental state of the organism, whether or not the organism's stressed, happy, sad. What are the thought processes of this individual? Okay, and so we can infer those mental processes from studying the behavior. Behavior is going to be observable actions. Well, plants have those too, and some researchers have suggested that plants are capable of changing their actions according to these basic psychological principles. That's been shown in pea plants. Monica Gagliano's been doing some work. I believe she's in Australia looking at those. But in here, what we're going to say is we're going to say that in order for it to fall under the purview of psychology, the organism needs to have a nervous system. So at this time, we're going to say, you know what, whatever they're doing with the plants, that's great. I'm very interested to learn about what they unearth and disclose and discover with the plants. But right now, we're just going to say that the organism has to have a nervous system in order for us to study their psychology. So we're talking about anything with an organism, any organism with a nervous system. So insects all the way up to humans, and of course other invertebrates. Mental processes. We're going to say that those are private. We can infer it from behavior or neurological activity. The goals of psychology as a discipline are to describe behavior, Sometimes we just need to state what's going on, and we don't need to really make any inferences. We don't need to test a theory. We just need to describe the behavior. Sometimes we want to intervene and try to affect behavioral change. Maybe we have some sort of intervention. We want to get a kid to pay more attention in school, so we intervene and we look at what changed in their behavior. Sometimes we want to explain the behavior. Sometimes we do have a theory and we want to provide evidence in support of or against that theory to some degree. And so we're looking for evidence that supports the theory or leads us to a better theory. And we can do experimentation to discover some of those truths. Sometimes we want to predict behavior. So sometimes we want to know, for example, will this individual fit well in this job? And how might we know that? Well, we already have a lot of individuals that have done well in that job. Does this individual's personality and characteristics fit with those other individuals? If that's the case, then maybe we can make a reasonable prediction about the trajectory of that individual in that job. Now, how does that all relate to lifespan growth and development? Well, sometimes we just want to describe development. Sometimes we want to affect change somewhere in the developmental process. Sometimes we want to explain theories such as Piaget's cognitive theory and see how accurate it is and see what we can do to expand upon the theory. And sometimes we want to make predictions, maybe from childhood, to predict what may happen in adulthood. Certainly Walter Mischel's done a lot of that work with self-control, looking at kids with high levels of self-control and their future life outcomes. All right, so we want to we want to take into consideration the scientific mind, and we want to get into that mindset. So a scientific mind is a critically thinking mind. It's very skeptical, and it never accepts absolute truths. It's always looking to expand upon comprehension and understanding, and it always knows that we don't know. And that's a very important thing. It is an objective mind in that experimentation and observations are very valuable. Data is very valuable. Okay? And so since data are very valuable, we want to make sure that we're giving data the credit they deserve. Then empirical methods. We may observe some phenomenon. We may ask questions about that phenomenon. We may collect data to answer our questions about the way we think the world may work. And then we form logical rationalizations that are connected to the data. Another thing we want to keep in mind is that by interacting with the world, we can come across these serendipitous findings, such as what Alexander Fleming found with penicillin. He actually didn't form penicillin, but he found a mold that was excreting a chemical that was killing off bacteria. Light bulb flashed on, and he said, "Hey, you know what? Let's see if we can isolate that compound, put it in ourselves, and kill off some bacteria." He didn't get that far to the last part. He just noticed the mold killing off the bacteria. Okay, so psychology is a science. There are applied aspects of psychology, but even those applied aspects of psychology are well rooted in the scientific method. There is a lot of art that goes on in a clinical setting, and certainly some clinicians are much better at working with patients because they have this somewhat artful approach to the clinical setting, and it allows them to do what they need to do. But psychology is a science. Hermann Helmholtz was the originator because he did all of he asked questions that we might still ask today in psychology, and most of his experiments were related to psychology in some way. However, he never called it psychology, but Wilhelm Wundt did. And so we're going to call Wilhelm Wundt the founder of psychology. He established the first laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. He trained graduate students, produced a publication within which all research for psychology could be housed. He traveled the world promoting psychology as a unique discipline. And so those are the reasons why we call Wilhelm Wundt the founder. The scientific method, the first step in the scientific method is observation. We can observe a phenomenon just about anywhere. You can observe a phenomenon in your relationships with other people by being out in nature on a walk. You could observe phenomenon by sticking your head in a book and staying there for a while and reading and asking questions and coming up with observations. You could observe phenomenon by browsing the internet. One of the things we want to keep in mind whenever we're doing that is we want bona fide, certified information. And how do we get that information? Well, one of the ways to do it is browse around on Google Scholar. You'll find a lot of peer-reviewed sources. Peer-reviewed sources are very important in that other researchers have evaluated and critiqued the research that's in front of you and that you're reading. A lot of the information on the web wasn't evaluated by anybody else. It just popped up. And so because somebody decided to write about it, and they may have misconceptions about some truth in the world, and we want to be cognizant of and cautious about that type of information. Even with peer-reviewed literature, we're cautious about it and skeptical. Remember, that's part of being a scientific mind, is to remain skeptical. But it's the best type of information. It's the most rich information that we have. If a theory is important, maybe we select a theory and we try to test it, and we want to identify the variables that are important for testing that theory. Then we want to form some hypotheses, and there are two types of hypotheses. First type is a research hypothesis. The second is a statistical. The statistical is more for inferential statistics, and we're not going to talk about it much more than that. The research hypothesis, you'll get more of it in statistics. But the research hypothesis is a formalized statement about the specific relationships between variables. So for example, if I were to make a prediction about student grades in class, I may say that students that regularly attend or attended all review sessions in general psych, this is lifespan, but in general psych, have higher grades than students that never attend a review session. So I've got two groups, ones that have always attended, ones that never attended, and I can look at the differences in their test scores. So I have a very formalized, specific statement about the relationship between those variables. The next step is testing those hypotheses. So we need to operationalize these definitions. So if you noticed in my previous hypothesis, I said they attended every review session. Well, does that mean just pop their head in and say hi and then leave without actually partaking in the review? So I might need to define my terms a little bit more specifically. Maybe it's those that showed up at the very beginning of the review and stayed for the entire review. Now, this also poses a problem because if I define it so strictly, maybe there are some that leave when I open the question and answer session at the end, but they do just fine in the class. So we really want to be careful with how we define our terms. And so what I always say is just try to stick as close to the literature as possible. How have other people defined these terms? Then we want to collect the data. We want to organize the data, analyze it, and form and test our hypotheses. And we want to stick very close to the data when we form our conclusions. So we don't want to stray too far away from what the data say. We don't want to insert our own interpretations into the data. The data can speak for themselves. So we want to make sure that we If there's evidence for a particular conclusion, for example, maybe I have evidence that for some of the test scores, my hypothesis was true. But for the overall performance in the class, maybe my hypothesis wasn't true. Maybe it didn't matter if they attended a review or not, um, in relationship to the overall performance in the class. So if that was the case, then I need to state that those data didn't show my hypothesis to be true. Then, to define psychology further for the purposes of this class, we need to state that what we're interested in is the study of behavior and underlying mental processes across the lifespan. So how consistent are these processes across the lifespan? How much do they change across the lifespan? So historically, it's been called cradle-to-grave psychology, but we're going to talk about it from conception to death. There's a lot that goes on prenatally that primes the individual for their future life in the environment. And if you don't take those factors into consideration, you miss a very important piece of the puzzle. So two different approaches. There's the traditional approach that views childhood and adolescence as a period of growth, adulthood as a period of stagnation, and old age as a period of decline. There is some truth in that if you do certain things, you can delay decline in old age and late adulthood. However, there is decline in old age, but we want to consider it, and there can be decline in childhood and adolescence too. It kind of depends on the individual circumstances, but we want to take into consideration lifespan versus health span. We're going to talk about health span more in the class as we get further down the road, but health span is generally the amount of years you spend living a healthy, fulfilled life, the life that you'd like to live. Lifespan is how long you chronologically live. You can have a very long lifespan and a very short health span. You could have a very long health span and a very short period of not having a very good life right at the end. And that's very possible. All right, so the other approach is the lifespan approach, where we look at growth as being possible in all age ranges and periods of development. And it's a multi-directional process that kind of breathes. There are periods of time where life's not so good. There are periods of time where there's growth again. And we're looking at plasticity and change, and looking at development as a very dynamic process and a contextual process. Some developmental perspectives. We're looking at growth as being a lifelong phenomenon. We're seeing multidimensional factors at play. So biopsychosocial means we have biological factors, psychological influences, and sociological influences or social influences that are going to change our development and alter the course of our development. It's multi-directional, and that skill sets can improve and decline depending on how much you're using them and maybe how healthy you are at a particular time. There's plasticity, much change can occur, and it's multidisciplinary. Biologists, sociologists, neuroscientists, anthropologists, and psychologists all want to know a little bit about development. Some perspectives. There are three different contextual perspectives of development that we want to consider. The first one is the normative age-graded influence. These are influences that are similar for all individuals in that particular age range. So for example, puberty. Puberty is something that's going to happen if the normal course of development takes place. And at puberty, things are going to change. Motivations, internal processes are going to change. The normative history graded influence is something that's similar for everyone in that generation. So the Vietnam War generation is was very different than the World War II war generation, and is very different from the modern generations, from like Desert Storm on to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So because of those influences and cultural influences and zeitgeist at the time, you're going to see a different psychology for individuals of those different generations. And it's not just war, it can be other things. It can be economic hardship like the Great Depression, that can influence these things. It would be the economic downturns, economic growth, um, and non-normative life events are unique individual or unique influences to that specific individual. So what has this individual gone through? What's contributing to their unique psychology? And the last thing, let me just go back to normative history graded influences. One of those could be the internet. It could be iPhone technology, so smart devices. Okay, relevance. So what is the relevance of this? Well, health and well-being, lifestyle choices, nutritional decisions are made. How does that affect developing offspring? What does that do for their longevity if kids are starting to eat healthy, nutritious food? What's our future going to look like? Those are big questions. Parenting, parents want to know how best to raise their children and provide them with the things that they need, and developmental psychologists can help. Education, developmental psychologists can help in the educational setting. For example, differences between bilingual and monolingual education, and as it relates to executive functions, we're seeing a lot of improved executive skills in individuals that are bilingual, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the class. Cultural influences, what are the beliefs, attitudes, and products produced within a certain culture, and how does that relate to development? Economics, gender, social policies are all influenced by individual development and can all influence individual development. And then the zeitgeist. What is the spirit of the times? What are the factors, social, economic, cultural factors of the times that can influence individual development? Some sources of change. There are biological processes, cognitive processes, socio-emotional processes, and interactional. And we want to keep in mind that all these are interactional systems. In other words, you don't have a cognitive process without a biological brain. You don't have an emotional process without an endocrine system, without hormones. And you don't have moral decision making without knowing the unique interplay between the social, emotional, and cognitive processes. So it's all an interactional system, and it's all very much contingent upon the context. Some periods of development. We have prenatal development, infancy, toddler, early childhood, middle and late childhood. I had a question from a student today about textbooks and sources and what's important for exams. Ultimately, that's what students really want to know. What do I need to know for the exam? Well, this is one of those slides where I'm a little cautious about giving you specific date ranges, because some of these things may change. We already know that over the course of evolutionary history, these things have changed between species. And so we really want, and even within our own species, there's been some change in these developmental stages and how we identify them. And so if you're looking at your textbook, you can go find another textbook that may have slightly different developmental age ranges. So don't stick too closely about the specific parameters for infancy being 18 to that's when it's ending about 18 or 24 months. So it's birth to 18 or 24 months. And don't stick to don't narrow your vision on those age ranges. Okay, it can fluctuate a little bit. Adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, these are all things we're going to talk about in this class. Adolescence is of particular interest. There's a lot that goes on in adolescence that can affect future development. But one of the things that we want to keep in mind with adolescence is particularly interesting is it varies across cultures quite a bit. Some cultures don't believe we have an adolescence. In our culture, in American society, we certainly do. And it may be the case that it's extending beyond the age of 20 into the mid-20s and late 20s for some individuals. So we want to, kind of ask ourselves, what really is adolescence? It's kind of an interesting period of development. Aging concepts. So we've got chronological age, biological age, psychological age, social age, and we also talked about health span. Okay, the period of life when you feel as though everything is the way it should be. You're healthy, you have healthy relationships, you have cognitive abilities that are appropriate for your age, you have reasoning skills that are appropriate for your age, and you're genuinely, somewhat, if you're not happy, you're at least, content and nurturing yourself to some degree. If somebody else may be nurturing you, that may be appropriate for that period in life, but you're not ill, you're not sick, and you don't have to have an overabundance of care, medical attention necessarily. Okay, debates. We have stability versus change. How stable are our traits throughout the lifespan? How much they change over the course of the lifespan? What about our cognitive abilities and affect? Are they stable? Do they change? Our tendency to socially interact, is it stable? Does it change? Then we have the nature versus nurture debate. And we're going to talk about how this isn't a truly dichotomous debate, how you can't really separate the two. Then we have continuity versus discontinuity. Continuity versus discontinuity just means, are we looking at periods, at development as flow, as a continuous flow throughout the life? Or are there stages of development? Are there unique, qualitatively different stages of development? And then the last thing I want you to be familiar with is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Well, what does that mean? That means ontogeny, the development of the individual, recapitulates, goes back through all the developmental steps of the species. Now, this has been a heavily contested and debated idea. Now, it is true that there are some questions and evidence against the pure observations and the purity of this theory, okay, of this concept, in that it's not exactly true that you exactly go through all the developmental stages of every species that led to being human. However, we all do start out as a single cell. We all start out as a single fertilized cell, and we divide, and at one point we look like some sort of alien fish-looking thing prenatally, and then at some point we start taking on, and we have a tail, and then at some point we lose the tail and we start looking more like a human, and then we're born and we look very much like a human with a ginormous head. Okay, and so the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is an idea that kind of just it guides research and gives us something to kind of grasp onto, and it allows us to ask questions about how similar and dissimilar are we to other species throughout the developmental process. Okay, psychoanalytic theory is going to look at underlying mental processes and conflicts that arise from those unresolved issues. Behavioral theories are going to look at how we can affect change in behavior. Many behaviorists took on and adopted an empty organism approach, meaning that if we just provide individuals with the appropriate stimuli or consequences, the behavior will change and the individual will be more productive or develop appropriately. And so we have fear conditioning with little Albert. We have operant conditioning with the pigeons. I'll let you watch that video. It's pretty cool. You get to watch pigeons read and respond to stimuli and get rewards for appropriately responding to stimuli. And then we get to away from that empty organism approach with Bandura's social cognitive theory and looking at deferred and delayed imitation and vicarious or observational learning. Piaget's, to discuss Piaget's theory, we need to bring into two terms: assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is where we take old processes, and he was most interested in mental processes, and apply it to novel situations. Accommodation is where we're going to adjust our old schemes to fit new experiences. So the example I like to give is if you're at the mall, maybe Grapevine Mills Mall or another mall with these ramps, and you're there on a busy weekend, you'll inevitably see parents walk with their kids, and there's this kid that can just started walking and feels super confident about the world and wants to run up that ramp, and mom and dad are immediately rushing behind the kid, and other caregivers are rushing behind the kid because they know what's going to happen. They know this kid is going to go through the process of assimilation. It's going to use its knowledge of running on flat ground while running on a ramp, and it's going to fail miserably and fall backwards. And so the parents and caregivers are running up behind like, whoa, this kid's going to fall backwards because it doesn't get it yet. And what does this kid really need to do? It needs to adjust its scheme a little bit so that it can successfully navigate that hill. Parents know it's going to take a while for a kid to really learn that it needs to adjust its positioning while walking on that ramp. Okay, well, the same is true for other cognitive processes. And so Piaget says that this mastery of accommodation takes time to develop. He proposed 4 different stages: sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete, operational, formal, operational. On this slide, I want you to be sure to watch the videos. It'll tell you a little bit more about it. I'll give you a little bit of information about the beaker test. Basically, you have 2 beakers filled with the same amount of fluid. You take one beaker, pour it into a very, very thin, tall, graduated cylinder, and now the water level appears higher relative to its former twin beaker. Okay, and so you ask a kid in the pre-operational stage which one has more, and they're going to say that the graduated cylinder has more. You ask a kid in concrete operational stage which one has more, and they're going to say that they have the same. Okay, because you just poured it from one container to the other. Now, so they're going to pass. The concrete operational child will pass, pre-operational child will fail. The Play-Doh test is where you take a ball of Play-Doh, you smash it out really thin and smooth on a piece of on a table, and the pre-operational kid goes, now that it's smashed out, it has more Play-Doh. Okay, because they're fixating on one component of the situation. For the concrete operational kid, they're going to say, you know what, these are the same. You could ball it back up, you could smooth it out, you could make it into different shapes, same amount of Play-Doh. Now, going back to the beaker test, if you're in the formal operational stage and you've washed dishes by hand before, you know that at the end of washing those dishes, you have to let them dry upside down. Why do you have to let them dry? Because the water's stuck to the sidewalls of the glass. So if you're really thinking through that beaker test, you're going to say that once I poured that beaker out into the graduated cylinder and moved that beaker away, that now the graduated cylinder actually had less fluid, just slightly less fluid, because there's still some water stuck to that other beaker. Okay. All right, now some other theories. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, information processing theory. These are covered fairly well in your textbook, so be sure to read about both of those theories. But here we're talking more about quantitative change or continuity rather than that qualitative change in those stage theories. Piaget was a stage theorist, Vygotsky was not. Erik Erikson is another stage theorist, and we have different dichotomous stages. By progressing through these stages in a healthy manner, it makes it a little bit more easy to progress through the next stage. So, for example, infants from birth to about 18 months, you remember the last slide was like 18 to 24 months. Okay, so infancy's already changed a little bit depending on how you look at this. Okay, but with trust versus mistrust, infant is totally dependent upon parents and caregivers to give them what they need. Food, warmth, burping, diaper changes, okay? All of these things they're solely dependent upon another person for. If infant's crying and screaming its head off and it gets the things that it needs, okay, then it will develop a sense of trust. Hey, I've learned I can trust other people to get me the things I need when I need them. If not, they'll develop a sense of mistrust and it will be harder for them to move through the next stage. The same is true of these other stages. If they're given opportunities, appropriate opportunities to develop like a sense of autonomy, a sense of initiative, a sense of industry, then they're more likely to progress into the next stage very well. Moving on, here are some other stages of Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory of psychosocial development. And he's putting a heavy social emphasis on development, saying that relationships are important, that we're social species. Interacting is important. This is important for appropriate development. Ethological theories are kind of interesting. These theories introduce an idea that there are critical and sensitive periods of development. In other words, for geese, shortly after they hatch, they'll imprint on they'll imprint an individual's features into their mind, and that's the individual they perceive to be a parent. And so Konrad Lorenz swimming there with the ducks, okay, is an example of that. Those ducks imprinted Konrad Lorenz features into their minds, and now Konrad Lorenz is now parent, okay, and they'll follow that individual around. Well, this is a critical period of development. If it doesn't happen, they don't imprint, okay, and it has to happen within a certain time frame, or it doesn't happen. With sensitive periods of development, it's a little bit different. It's if something happens during this period of time, it's more likely that appropriate development could occur, or development could be hindered if this happens. Okay, but if it doesn't happen, that doesn't necessarily mean that appropriate development can't occur. Okay, and so there's always this debate about what's a critical period, what's a sensitive period. Are most things sensitive periods? Are most things critical periods? Jeannie was a feral, not really a feral child. She's an abused child that was strapped to a potty chair and locked away in a room for years beyond the onset of puberty, and she didn't develop very good language skills. And I believe this was out in Los Angeles. I want to say 80s, maybe early 90s, maybe earlier than that. I can't quite remember. 70s. There's the citations down in the bottom. So this was the 70s, and I believe it was out in LA. But she was a very abused child. She couldn't. She didn't have appropriate language skills, but while working with Jenny, she did develop some language skills, indicating that some of these things some language abilities are consistent with sensitive periods of development rather than critical periods of development. In other words, if things don't happen, appropriate language skills won't become used by the individual. All right, ecological theory is one of my favorites. Bronfenbrenner. I took taken a closer look at Bronfenbrenner's theory because it's an extremely parsimonious theory and consistent with modern understandings of parsimony. Parsimony isn't just simple. Parsimony is simple and complete. The complete part is very important. Okay, and Bronfenbrenner has a very complete theory. He incorporates macro level systems, that's the individual context and things that are unique to the individual. Mesosystems are the connection between the micro and ecosystems, exosystems. The exosystems are like influences and work settings from other individuals like parents. So parents go to work, interact with boss. Boss has an influence on parent. Parent comes home, takes those influences, and then indirectly influences the kid with the boss's influence. Okay, so because of and friends and colleagues influences have an influence on kid, even though kid has maybe never even met those other individuals, but they're connected because of the parent. Macro systems are the cultural systems of the time. What's going on culturally in that period of time? And then the chronosystem is time. So how do these other systems change across time to influence individuals' development? Okay, it's very easy to look back, for example, at a period of development. For example, vivisection is something I look at and go, how could you do that? Live dissection of an animal when it's screaming its head off while you cut into it. It's something that happened a long time ago, centuries ago, and it was to gain an understanding of the physiological and anatomical systems within an animal. And it's something we wouldn't do today, and we can look back on that and go, well, those vivisectionists, horrible, evil people, but they didn't know what we now know about anesthetic, and they didn't know what we now know about mental processes in animals. And this can even be true just for a few decades ago. We can look back just a couple decades and go, how could somebody behave that appallingly? Well, just a few decades ago, we didn't even have the internet. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have text messaging. We didn't have a way to share information this readily and this quickly to form a pseudo-collective consciousness that we do today. And so we've got to keep in mind that chronosystem and how these things are changing. And they're changing very rapidly in modern times. Bronfenbrenner has a few other aspects of the theory. You can go ahead and read a little bit more about Bronfenbrenner. You have the peer-reviewed source. You have his original work. And then I want you to also watch the video and understand Bronfenbrenner's conceptualizations of the nature versus nurture debate. Okay. All right, so some methods of data collection. We can collect data in a laboratory. We can form naturalistic observations where we go out into the field and just kind of watch and monitor behavior. We can do case studies where we follow one individual around, documenting their behavior, maybe looking at behavioral changes based on interventions, maybe even testing theories or making predictions about their behavior. We can have surveys to collect a lot of information. With surveys, you always want to make sure you follow it up with real behavioral data. So if everybody tells you that they'd rather buy the pink shirt than the green shirt, well, then you need to go to your store and make sure that the sales data actually matches the survey data, and make sure that they correlate to, or the survey's junk. Interviews are ways of getting some background information on individuals, standardized tests, and there are different types of interviews. There are structured, semi-structured, unstructured interviews, and for different settings and different purposes, they may all have their utility. Standardized testing is something that's strongly used in the education system. It's used in other professions as well. And physiological measurements are sometimes used to kind of understand what's going on with the sensory systems of this individual and what's going on with the processing speed of this individual. Research designs, we have descriptive studies, we have correlational research where we're looking at the relationships between variables. We have positive correlations, negative correlations, and no correlations. Your book does a good job of talking about these different designs, so I'll leave it up to your book. Do know the difference between independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are ones that are controlled by the experimenter. Dependent variables are those variables that are measured. Okay, those are your maybe behavioral measures. Okay, or your scores on a test. Experimental versus control group. Experimental groups receive the manipulation, and control group doesn't. Okay, sometimes in developmental psychology and in developmental psychological research, we have research designs that persist, or we have research designs that don't persist all that long but take into consideration the differences in the chronosystem or generational differences. Cross-sectional approaches are going to look at different individuals. They're all going to be tested at the same time, but they're of different age ranges, and then those comparisons are going to be made at the same time. So this research could be a week, 2 weeks, it could be very short in overall duration, and you're making those comparisons between age ranges and across individuals, but it's all done at the same time. Longitudinal, you're going to follow a group of individuals for their whole life, see what happens. Cohort effects, or where we're looking at historical groups and how they relate or are different. Some ethical considerations need to be taken into account when we're talking about doing research. We always want informed consent. We want to keep our participants' confidentiality intact. We don't want their information getting out to the general public. We want to make sure that we debrief these individuals. If there was any deception involved in the process, they need appropriate debriefing. They need to know why they were deceived in some way. Why weren't they told the full purpose of the experiment up front? Well, there may be good reason for that, and that's okay, but you need to come back and you need to make sure that they know why that was done, and you need to ease their minds a little bit and put their minds at ease. And then if you found something, for example, if you found that a cancer medication did work, you need to come back and offer that to the participants that didn't receive it. Okay. Last thing, institutional review boards. I'll let you watch that video. And then we want to keep one thing in mind about the animals. They don't have a voice, so they can't go put their, thumbprint or paw print on a piece of paper and sign away their psychological consciousness temporarily to you and let you just, do whatever you want to them. So we have different provisions and controls and considerations for studying animal behavior that's actually more rigorous than an institutional review board and their approval process, because they can't say no. They can't say, leave me alone, I don't want to participate in this anymore, go away. They can't do that. Humans can do that. Animals can't communicate on that level with us. So we have an ICOOC, an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, that oversees all animal research. And different institutions may have ICOOCs or not. They may have IRBs or not. Just depends on what they're doing at the institution. Okay, here's a list of references, and if you notice, there are several references. And going back to the question that I had today about textbooks and resources, there are far too many references here for you to read all of these before this class ends. Maybe some of you are excellent speed readers, but I certainly don't expect you to go through and study all of these sources in great detail. Where these sources are overlapped with what we discussed in lecture, with what's on the slides, that is what will be on the exam. You don't need all of these books, you don't need all of these resources to be successful in this class. It might be helpful to you, and one day you might want to go read these, and if you do, I encourage you to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and that concludes our first lecture for 2314, Lifespan Growth and Development, and I hope you very much enjoyed it.